All About Relationships is an engaging, lighthearted, and practical show designed to help people improve their relationships in meaningful ways. Hosted by Dr. Don Allen, a certified Gottman therapist, as well as an advanced trainer for the Institute. He is also certified in emotion-focused therapy. With over 40 years of experience in the field of psychotherapy, Dr. Allen is here to provide expert guidance on strengthening marriages, parent-child relationships, friendships, and more. Through insightful discussions, audience call-ins, and guest experts, viewers receive real-world strategies to enhance intimacy, communication, and overall relationship satisfaction. So now, please welcome the host of All About Relationships, Dr. Don Allen.
And welcome back. This is Dr. Don Allen. This is the show working towards ideal marriages and loving relationships, specifically all about relationships. So we're going to have a fun hour here. We're going to talk about a really interesting topic. I went back and forth about whether to put this on my show for a while now, but I've had enough people talk to me about this particular issue that I thought it would be a good one for us to try to tackle today. The title of my show is Media, Relationships, and Reintegration, What History and Science Teaches Us. And the reason I put that there is, and most people have at least had some exposure to this idea that maybe, just maybe, being on devices too much can be a problem for relationships and relationships with your kids. So I put a few interesting facts down about it. But then I wanted to divide my show up into kind of some history. One of the things I like to talk about on my show is it has to be true 2,000 years ago, and it will probably be true 2,000 years from now. And the reason I do that is I don't want to get all tied up into current events, and I don't particularly care for sensationalism. I'm much more interested in having people have really good quality relationships in their life. So that's what I'm focused on. So with that in mind, let's kind of look at some of the things I want to talk about today. Remember, one of the things I always talk about is what have I done for my relationship today? Well, the good news is we're here. And this is certainly one that you are doing for your relationship. And in the fourth segment, when I have a fun, let's all go home and try something together, and I'll give a little bit of an assignment for that, just purely for fun, you'll have an opportunity to do even more. So that's where we're going with this. The other thing, too, is what goes into a successful relationship. We talk about that every week. The other one is what undermines relationships. And I bet you're going to hear that today. And then I will talk a little bit about what destroys relationships, but only in the sense of that it's cautionary. And what I mean by that is, for the most of us, if we do the things that work, generally speaking, we can avoid catastrophe. Okay. And some of my past shows, I've talked about that. With the Gottman method, I talk about the four horsemen, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. Arguing when you're flooded, which means you're so upset that the chemicals in your body disconnect your thinking brain, but you keep fighting anyway. Can't do that. So we have ways to get back to where we're feeling connected so we can reach for our partner in healthy ways. So we're always going to keep that in mind. So, like I said, media, relationships, and reintegration. So part of what I want to do is just kind of reflect with you. I always do that. So one of the things that we notice is today's children are more connected than ever, but yet we're getting all these reports that they're more isolated. Right. Well, what seems to be causing that? I'm just going to show you a couple books I really like, and I didn't put these on my overhead screen, but I'll be talking a lot about these two books today because this is kind of where I got my research, and I'm also really, really proud of these researchers for what they have given us. The first book is just called Generations by Jean Twenge. She's a professor, I think out of San Diego State University, but she's amazing. And I'd love to get her on the show, but she's probably really, really successful and popular. And I imagine she has a busy schedule. But this book, really what I like about it is it talks about 5 generations of us, the last 5 generations. And it talks about the phenomenon not only of media, but it also talks about what was important to each generation, what were their challenges, and it helps us understand more about people. And when we begin to understand more, we can accept influence. What was the world like for you? And to really listen. And that's a hallmark of the Gottman method, is to really accept influence and seek to understand before we seek to fix. The other thing too is the media a lot of times, maybe for sensationalization, but maybe to factually report too. They want to give us information, but they also want to keep us watching. So we'll talk a little bit about that phenomenon. The other book I really like is a book by a person, and I hope I got his name right. It's Jonathan Haidt, but he wrote this book called The Anxious Generation. And I really like this book, and I recommend it to you. Because what it says, if you look at that, it says how the great rewiring of childhood, let me slow that down. The great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. Well, again, the same thing that we talked about with Jean Twenge. She's got hard science now that we've really caused concerns and problems. The other thing I want to say, though, is that we want to look at this phenomenon today, but we also want to say, what does society do for countermeasures with this? That old expression, nothing is new under the sun. I want to give some context to this because my faith is always on people not only in the United States, but around the world. We can make our world better. We can choose that. But the first thing is to slow down and be mindful about some of the effects and side effects that can be caused in our topic today with the media. So I'm going to talk about the history of this. And part of why I do that is to give you hope and to give you a way to think about the world so that we can empower ourselves in our families and in our friendship circles and in our communities to really take back what is core to the human existence. So we're going to talk about that today. Sounds pretty heady, right? But I'm going to talk about that in practical ways. I'll try not to sound like a college professor. Okay. So a couple of things I always put down at the beginning, some sound bites. First one, today's children are more connected than ever, but they're also more isolated, right? Well, what does that mean? How is that happening, right? Schools are beginning to recognize overexposure to screens, social media, and constant stimulation has fractured focus, empathy, and attention. I kind of notice that personally, and for what it's worth, and it's not scientific, but I'll notice that a lot of times, like if I go to a restaurant and order something, sometimes I don't know whether the order I'm giving is going to somehow get back to me in what I ordered. Especially true, like I said, when I go fast food, if I do. But it's interesting, because I wonder, can people keep things in their head like they used to? Well, there's science that, studies this, right? The Surgeon General in the United States has warned that we can no longer assume these technologies are safe for youth. And we've really seen that around the world. Certain countries are banning smartphones before the age of 15. And we're also looking at school in terms of getting these devices out of the way so people can go back to human interaction. Okay. But, this is part of what Haidt's books talk about. We're entering a new age of reintegration. And I should say with that book, just, like I said, I'd like to introduce you to that. But with Jonathan's book here, I really like him. And he has TED Talks that you can actually talk. So if you say, oh, gosh, Don, that looks like a pretty thick book. I don't know that I want to read it. Well, you know what? That's what's great about the media, because we can go and we can look at different things like podcasts, TED Talks, and we can get a lot of information very quickly. So that's always good. All right. But exposure to the media and relationships such as marriages and other adult connections can make these bids for connection go toward devices. And this can be a problem, and I'll explain a little bit why that is. I'm sure you've heard it on my show before. When couples connect with each other, hi, honey, I'm home. Hey, I'm upstairs. That's a bid for connection that's received, right? Well, we need to approximate 86% success rate on those bids. We need to show up for our partner in a way that they identify that you showed up and you care. When these bids fall short, it starts to put us into attachment distress because our bodies are wired to feel safe when we're connected with the most primary people in the world that we love. If the media is getting all of these attentions and that number falls below 33%, now people start going into attachment distress. And those are hard numbers from the Gottman research. So we want to make sure that we have those successful bids and we keep them up. Okay. So what we need to do is we need to understand what the tools are for connecting. And we also want to know how people, and I got to tell you, I think a lot of it for most people is just an innocent drift into more and more connection with these devices. I remember a long time ago, I'm going to age myself, but you used to take these 3.5 discs and push them in a computer and you would load the software. And I remember distinctly one time I was loading it and I finished and I looked up and I go, my gosh, it's dark. I wonder what time it is because, it was daylight when I was starting. This took about 8 hours. And I looked up and it was like 2:30 in the morning. And I had no idea that kind of time had passed. Well, that phenomenon, I'm sure, is equally true today. You get into your device and you look up and we lose a sense of time. Well, if we lose a sense of time and we didn't talk to our partners, those bids can very innocently go away. So we have to look at that. So we want to look at human nature and life in these times, but how this has been consistent throughout. Okay. One of the things I notice is, generally speaking, people are pretty resilient and can find ways through adversity. Recently, look at COVID. I mean, for some people, it really affected them negatively. And I still really, my heart hurts for those people. But a lot of people found a way through COVID. And a lot of people now are in a world that moves on like it used to. One thing I noticed from a time perspective, and this isn't scientific, I just notice it, is people will tell me, prior to COVID, it seems like it's like 100 years ago. It just seems like prior to COVID and now just seems like time is so far away from that. I found that to be an interesting phenomenon that I've heard frequently. But one of the things I've noticed is people found a way through. Okay. But remember, we were doing something called stay in your bubble or shelter in place. And one of the things that happened for some people is they found a way to connect outside of sheltering in place. They went on Skype, they went on Zoom, they went on other platforms, and they found ways to connect, but it was two-dimensional. It wasn't the same as being with somebody sitting next to them in a room, just like here, right? Correct? But one of the things that I noticed for some people is those bubbles offered some connection that resembled the 1930s. Now, I wasn't around back then, but I did notice television shows and stuff. The one that really comes to mind from a long time ago was the show The Waltons. And the Waltons were always together. The big family, always together, came home from school. Everybody ate dinner together. They said goodnight, Mary Ellen, goodnight, John Boy, if you've ever seen the show. And they really connected. And when there was problems in the community or in the family, they all had a high degree of interaction and bids for connection. For some families during shelter in place, that's what happened. They really enjoyed the connections they were having with their family and their community. Okay. So in that capacity, using the media to get through this has been really helpful and in some ways a godsend. In some ways, it just rewired the fabric of our society because nowadays, look at what we're doing here. Being on television, being on media, and being able to connect with each other in a grassroots way has become a new norm. So this is new and it can be good. Okay. One of the things I think of is nowadays I will get from my friends, little humorous pictures, comedy, short videos that entertain us, right? I particularly like cat joke ones, but some people like the other ones as well, right? The other thing too is we can connect with stuff. I hope you notice behind me, I now have a Halloween kind of images there. I got my black cat. I got a couple pumpkins. A friend of mine carved that little squirrel right by my flowers over there, but the flowers are nicely autumn. So just fun to celebrate and connect with you in that way, because that's the spirit of our time right now. Okay. Let me look at my time. I got about another minute, I think, maybe 30 seconds. So I tell you what I think I'll do. I'll just really remind you that part of what I want you to think of today is that 86% bids of connectivity with people, actually connection with them. Very important. We want to keep that in mind. Remember the friendship house, build fondness and admiration, know our partner's internal world, and then successful bids for connection. So what I want you to do is pay attention to those things and how media possibly can get in the way of that. We're not going to do a mailbag today. We're going to go right to another segment because there's so much information with regard to the media that I want to share with you that I'm just going to skip that segment. But we're going to go right to some more very interesting things. So stay tuned and we'll see you in about a minute or so.
Mike Zorek, a three-time California state champion in Greco-Roman wrestling at 114 pounds. Mike, blind since birth, was born in Hartford, Connecticut. He was a six-time national placer, including 2 seconds, 2/3, and 2/4. He also won the Veterans Folk-Style Wrestling twice at 152 pounds. In all these tournaments, he was the only blind competitor. Nancy Zorek, a creative spirit whose talents have taken her to the stage and into galleries and exhibitions in several states. Her father, a commercial artist who shared his instruments with his daughter and helped her fine-tune her natural abilities, influenced her decision to follow in his footsteps. Ms. Zorek has enjoyed a fruitful career doing what she loves. Listen Saturday mornings at 12 Eastern for the Nancy and Mike Show for heartwarming stories and interesting talk.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of The Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on The Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
All right, and we're back. What I want to do now is shift a little bit. We're going to go to kind of the history of some of what we are noticing to better equip us to kind of understand the context of the problem that media can generate. But we're also going to look at, hope for the future and a way to kind of wade out of some of the problems that we're doing in a way that recaptures our ability to be close and loving towards our people. Remember, this is all about relationships, and I encourage you to go back and watch past episodes because it can really give you some great ideas about how good relationships happen and what you can do. So I put up on the board here, if you want to contact me, feel free to do it. I really love doing that. I really love getting feedback from people. It helps me set my shows for the future, but I can also answer good questions. And again, it makes me feel like I'm getting that community coming back towards me. So please feel free to contact me at those numbers if you would like. So we're going to look at some research in our third segment, but right now I want to talk a little bit about history. So the first thing I want to talk about is something that is got to do with what I call hardware. Hardware is how our body works, right? It's like when you go to the doctor, they look at your body and they know how different things happen and they can predict, if we do this, it will help the body in these ways. So there was a neuropsychologist named Donald Hebb, H-E-B-B, and he wrote a book back in 1949. So it's a classic called The Organization of Behavior. Okay. And this was his neuropsychological theory. But what he found is that nerve cells in the brain fire together. And then after they fire together, they wire together. They start to work together in sequence. So think about if you were playing piano and you kept playing piano, and after a while you could just play it, right? And then you can start putting mood in it. You can start putting energy in it that makes it sound like the music you're used to hearing on the internet and connections with that. So what happens is this attention to these neurons shape connection. So when we repeatedly turn towards a partner's bids for affection and connection, the brain builds those pathways and also secretes chemicals that make us want to stick and stay. We like that, right? We get dopamine hits, right, from that. And then glutamate remembers those dopamine hits and we want to do it more. So all of that neurobiology wires our brain for those connections, okay? But when we turn towards screens, we turn towards media and away from people, it weakens those potential connections with other people by definition because we're not making them, right? So this is something, like I said, that's always been true from a neurobiological perspective. Remember, what's true 2,000 years ago. But let's look a little bit about how that's played out in history, okay? Because this is going to give us help to fight this issue when we have problems with our connections with others, right? So one of the things that happened is there was a lady by the name of Zargarnik, and she was in the 1920s. She was a Russian psychologist. Her first name was Bluma. And Bluma discovered that there's a tendency to stay preoccupied with unfinished tasks. Now, I understood that, nowadays with, stuff like what we talk about with relationships. But the first time I learned that was back in 1976. I'll age myself. I took a Psych 201 course at my undergraduate school, and they talked about her. And what they basically talked about was the Zargarnik effect in this way. If I give you something on the news and it worries you, so you're sure to pay attention to it, they call that the Zargarnik effect. So like if I said, big hurricane coming, it may bestride the East Coast. Stay tuned tonight for details at 11. You might think, wow, I better look at 11 o'clock because I want to see if that hurricane is going to affect me. So that would be a Zargarnik effect. It would be the way of keeping it in your mind, right? So with the media, we are constantly bombarded with alerts, notifications, and those types of things that keep us open and preoccupied, but it also can steal the focus from the present moment and the people around us. So see, this can steal our bids, right? And again, people who want you to watch their stuff, have studied this and they're very good at trying to get you to do that, right? So even with me starting today, I'm hoping when you saw the beginning of my show, you might say, wow, I want to pay attention to this. This is really interesting. So that would be a Zargarnik effect, you see. And it's good because we're looking at this for positive ways of having a relationship, right? Okay. But when we disconnect from people, especially when we go below that 33% bids, what happens is we are mentally open and preoccupied, right? But now it's with isolation and loneliness and maybe recurring thoughts of rejection. So one of the things that can happen is it can open us up to maybe using some of the things that don't work, like the four horsemen, or arguing when we're flooded because we're feeling rejected. And we use bad habits to stay connected to people, negative attention. And that's not going to help our bids for connection. The other thing is if we're predisposed towards, I don't want to deal with any of that, I'll just go more into my device, then it actually works in the opposite direction. So we don't want that. We don't want that. So history of the world. Imagine looking at war-torn Italy in World War II. Just imagine images of that. And then all of a sudden, imagining really nice images of kids in Italy really having fun on the playground, really working together and playing with each other and laughing and giggling and being spontaneous and playing. So hold those two thoughts in your mind, okay? So the people of Reggio Emilia, Italy, didn't just rebuild their homes after World War II because they that was devastated by the war, but they actually had to rebuild childhood itself. So the leaders of the community got together and they realized how much this was affecting these kids. So what they had to do is they had to think about it. So what they did was they created schools where children's imagination was the curriculum, okay? And play was the path to recovery. So they began to look at how to make kids laugh, play, and be spontaneous. Play for children, and you all know this, I presume. Play for children is kind of preparing us for adult life. I mean, we may have, for those of you who like cats, you see them when they're kittens, they play. Well, what do they play? They play hunting and stalking and running things down and doing all the things that would prepare them if they were in the wild to hunt and eat. Right? So that skill of playing allows them to sharpen those skills. We do that in our society. For example, 9-year-old play in America. You might have a few kids that want to play baseball. Well, they have things like Ghost Man on first, which means, we don't have enough people. So if the guy from the hitting the ball goes to first base, we assume the Ghost Man goes to second base. But the kids have to make their own rules, agree on them, enforce them, and then get back to spontaneous play. This is what play is this is why it's so essential for children, right? Okay. So the philosophy that treated play and art as an expression that was an essential foundation of returning kids to normalcy was something that they figured out in Italy and did such a good job. But that was after World War II. So here, this is another thing where we were worried about our children, but we came up with a plan, and that's what happened. The other thing children do when they play is they will play what's going on in the world. So for those of you who remember the bubonic plague, the kids used to play a game called Ring Around the Rosie, a pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. And then they would be in a circle because they were in a ring, and then we all fall down, they all died. Okay, so they were actually playing what was happening to people when they happened. Ring Around the Rosie was the pox that people would get as a symptom from the plague. But you probably didn't know this one. They played this right at the end of the Spanish flu or during that. And this one went like this. The kids would sing, I know a bird whose name is Enza, right? Open up the window, influenza. Well, the flu was killing people. So it came in the window, it was the flu, and guess what happened? So the kids were actually singing that song and making that song up during that particular plague. So it's interesting how kids find a way to be resilient throughout time. But let's look at some of these other ones. I actually just had some fun doing some review on this. In ancient Greece, now this was 500 to 300 BC, Padia, play and virtue with children and people produced empathy. So they encouraged that kind of behavior in order for people to thrive in their society. In ancient China, 551 BC to 479, Confucius, ritual and harmony in families. Okay, where you're hearing all of the stuff we talk about with the Gottman Institute, right? Bid for connections, having harmony, things we do. I just showed you Halloween behind me. Well, that's a ritual. And the communities get together a lot of times with that, right? And they play and the kids come around and they get to talk to their neighbors. Very nice. In Scotland, and this is modern times rather, 560 to 696, long time. Universal schooling was civic. In other words, everybody got an education in Scotland, started then. And what they found was it was a glue in society. So let's come into America now. And in 1907, 1910, the Boy Scouts started. Well, the Boy Scouts, play, group connection through adversity, toughening up, discipline, surviving hardship together. Boy Scouts were seen as a way to raise children to be stronger, more resilient adults. 1912, the Girl Scouts came along. Okay, same deal. Now let's do this with the girls. Equality through service and skill. All right, service, doing things for other people. To this day, we buy Girl Scout cookies. And why do we do that? Well, we support the Girl Scouts, but they come over and they provide us with some really wonderful things. Last one I'll talk about, looking at my time, is that Title IX, 1972, equal play, equal participation, money for girls and boys to build strong bodies, community, group cohesion, and learn how to function as a group. Extremely important. And we still have those things today, and we still have challenges with them today, but hopefully people are looking at what the best practices are for everybody to win as much as we can. So these are good examples of how, working together as a team has built that. But inanimate pursuits, taking and looking at things that don't build that might be good in the short run or in doses. But if you get away from the connection with people, you're in trouble. So back to, okay, so what do I need to do? I want to look 2,000 years ago, and I actually consulted the Bible. And in the Bible, Malachi 4:6 says, he will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of their children to their parents. So this is one of the things we talk about. Remember Tolstoy, there's a million bad families, but only one good one. This is the good one. Okay. So in Psalms 115, we are warned about worshiping idols, right? Well, I don't know about you, but if I listen to that, I think of people building idols back 2,000 years ago, right? But what the psalm says is things that have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They were carved from stone back then. Today they glow in our hands, right? And they're compelling, and they talk to us, and they nurture us, and they make us feel great. I know I, just because it's new, have looked at and played a little bit with AI, and AI wants to talk to me like it's a relationship. I know it's not, but some people can get pulled into that, can't they? And kids, especially if they aren't getting those bids for connection and they go to that, and then it's loving and nurturing and caring and supportive, well, you can have problems. And one thing I've noticed in some AI, that sometimes if it tells you it can do something, it tells you with absolute confidence when it can't. So you have to look at that. We all know that from the idea of Dr. Google, right? Look up something on Google and then freak us out, right? So I'm going to break. I wanted to go over a little bit, but we'll come back, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the research history and then how to get to positive. We'll see you soon.
Master of words, powerful player. What life-changing words can Dr. Janet Smith Warfield pull out of her magical toolbox that just might mysteriously open a door you never knew was there? A door to free yourself from fear forever. Transform your rage into right action. Release your guilt. Position you into a life of freedom, purpose, passion, power, and peace. All quite suddenly, unexpectedly, and almost miraculously, with no effort on your part. Join Dr. Janet on Dancing with Words, Dancing with Wisdom, as she and her guests show you how words map our experiences, immersing you in a sound bath that relaxes your muscles, opens your mind, and supports you in co-creating your extraordinary life. Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness: Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals.
All right. Well, now that we've kind of looked at the history and noticed that some of the stuff, nothing is new under the sun. Maybe they're different challenges, but nonetheless, we still have to raise our kids well, and we still have to have great relationships. Part of what I reflect on is, if you look back in the days, I don't know. I always like to look back when Jane Austen or Mozart and Beethoven roamed the earth, right around 1800. George Washington was around. And one of the things about that time is people didn't necessarily live as long as they do to this day. So sometimes people would get married a lot younger than we do now because they had to. And a lot of people made it to 30, 35 years old. Mozart only lived to 35. I mean, if you lived after 50, you're pretty much an old person back then. Jane Austen, I think, died at 42. And the other thing is people died of really tough things. I mean, if you look back in the history, people were dying of typhus. They were dying of consumption, which is now known as tuberculosis. And people would have a lot of kids because not a lot of the kids would make it to 20, right? So different times, different generations had different ways of having to deal with challenges. Wars, for example, in a lot of the world has really shaped and colored things. Think of the Ukraine right now and how that's affected their society, right? So we want to be mindful about, you know, what happens in society because we can very quickly just blame this on the media. But the reality of it is, in the last 50 years, even, and this is from Gene Twange's book, the rise and fall of certain things have emerged, and people have had to overcome and deal with those, and it has shaped their fears and their worries and how they raise their kids and how they have relationships. For some people in war-torn countries, they also have trauma and PTSD that affects relationships. So it's complicated. It really is. But we don't want to make it unicausal. But we do know the rise of the smartphone really, really began to take hold and shape the way we see the world. The other thing is that I know from television technology, the quality of the picture on screens on media is really amazing now. But I don't remember when it actually shifted. I think it was around 2009. I don't remember. But all of a sudden, it just becomes our new normal. So we don't stop and think that things have changed, but in reality, that they have. So for Gen Zers, phones have replaced much of face to face social life. Friendships are thinner, romantic lives delayed, right? How much money you can make, what your debt is. A lot of people go to college, have incredible debt. They can't buy houses, right? Well, that's going to affect how they see the world as well, not just media. But again, we need to be mindful of the fact that togetherness has been diminished by the fact of that, right? And Gene Twange's book, again, like I said, 5 Generations. I really encourage you to read that book because it adds context. It adds context to what we're up against, right? And you can really look at this and what they believed in. I know just because of my age, I remember my grandparents and what they thought and what they believed in. Very different than today. We also have much more psychological sophistication. People have been educated in different things, and we do better, I think, as a whole in society to understand why we need to have feelings and talk about them. We need to understand why we say what we want instead of what we don't want. All of these things are just good habits now that we can rely on to make relationships even better. Okay. But one of the things that Jonathan Haidt's books talks about is our task is now emotional reintegration. How do we come back together as a society? How do we make that happen with our kids? How do we make that happen today? Right? How do we do that? I mean, for example, do people join, I don't know, softball clubs and they all get together once a week and they play softball, even if they aren't very good? Do they just get together? I know for me, it's tennis. I love to get together with the tennis community and play in a league. But for me, it's not whether I win or not. For some people, it is. But for me, it's just if I get out there and get some good exercise and enjoy some good connection with some buddies, really, really means a lot to me. Okay. So we need to do that. Jonathan's book on the anxious generation, overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world has created an anxiety-based generation for kids. We don't want that. I often think about that. If somebody, some man you didn't know in a hoodie came into your house and just walked upstairs to your kid's room and just stayed there for 3 hours and you didn't say, who are you or what are you doing? That's what the internet can be. We would never let somebody in our house like that, but they infiltrate potentially through those devices. So I always kind of see devices as like that. So I want to make sure I know what's going on with that, right? But, that anxious generation, anxiety is what happens when people don't feel like they have the skills to solve a problem. Our body begins to give us chemicals to help us fight, flight, and freeze. So all of a sudden, if we're not understanding how to be social in school, you can be anxious, right? And do people love us? Are people solid? When you go to school and you have that inner confidence that your parents love you no matter what, right? And if you go and you get a D on your math test, doesn't matter because they know how hard you studied. You studied because you wanted to, and you couldn't wait to get back home to talk about how, yeah, I got a D, but I think I know how to get an A the next time. Let's talk about it. And then you work together That's a lot different than if you get a D and you just go upstairs and you fret about it and then your self-esteem goes down. So we need to have those interconnections to help make sense of the world, right? Okay. So these micro connections that happen with these media devices, those instant, staccato reinforcers are actually the opposite of what I teach with Gottman and turn toward bids. So it actually not only undermines it, but it's the opposite of what I want. So, that's what begins to happen to couples, right? The other thing too is their eye contact. Do people actually look at each other? Do people actually know how to read faces? Can you stay connected in the short term on the conversation you're talking to? Really, really, really important. All right. So this is one of the things I guess we're going to talk about in the fourth segment is some practical guides to get back to and retake these, right? So just really, really important stuff. I'm looking at some of the reintegration focus throughout history right now, if you're wondering why I'm looking to the side, right? But, I mentioned earlier in the 1910s to the 1930s, integrating play into moral formation, right? Well, what's a moral compass? What do we believe in as a society? What is being patriotic? What is love of family? What is love as country? What is the love of the world? These things are all important, but kids don't necessarily just know them. We have to teach them. The other thing we need to do as adults is we have to get back to context. We have to seek to understand the world before we try to fix it. And that's why I like the Twenge book so much, because it really talks about what was important to each generation. One thing I want to do before I get to the last one is I want to shout out to a person who I just was very impressed with. Her name was Viola Spolin. Okay. And one of the things that's really neat about her, I think you'll understand in a minute, because I think, now again, I didn't see any direct research that connected her exactly to kids. But certainly her research, I think, influenced it. So just want to shout out, me, I'll shout out to people that I think are really cool. But she was born Viola Mills in Chicago, way back when, 1906, I guess it was. And she studied social work and higher education with a woman by the name of Neva Boyd, who was a sociologist. And she really did a lot with recreational group work. Okay. So again, what are we talking about? We're talking about recapturing people through that connection. But I think this was so cool, and I think you will too. So Boyd emphasized that group play and non-competitive games fostered social learning, creativity, and community among children, especially in immigrant and urban settings. Chicago. Well, you got to think back in those days. I mean, in social work, that's Hull House, Hull, right? And building settlement housing and all those kind of things. That's Jane Addams stuff for those social workers out there, right? And one of the things that they were trying to do was build community when people were immigrating, when people were just forming societies. But here's the cool thing with that. Spolin adapted many of those plays and movement techniques that she learned from Boyd into theatrical exercise, right? So what she eventually called those back in, I think it was in the early 60s, she wrote a book, if I'm not mistaken, but it was called Theater Games, right? Now, why is this important to you? Because a lot of this stuff was the precursor to Second City Television and Saturday Night Live, right? And it was now I don't know that they actually connected this with her, but the yes and premise behind comedy, which is whatever somebody says, you go with it and you add something. Yes and, right? So a lot of that stuff, I think she was a pioneer in doing that. But the reason I like it is because if you get kids together and you do improv with them, kids are naturally creative. It forces not only interaction, but you can't be wrong. You can go up there, you can take a risk. The funny happens when you try. And so I just think she was really essential in a lot of that kind of play in theater. And like I said, a lot of that stuff is a proliferation of what we're seeing on television today when we see comedy. So I just want to shout out to her. Right here it is. Improvisation for Theater, published in 1963. Right? Her son, Paul Sills, used methods in the Compass Players, which was a precursor to Second City. So just want to shout out to her because I think she's done a lot of what we're talking about that today, which is how do you recapture it? The other reason I talked about Spolin is because kids will do things because they enjoy it. Now, there was some controversy with this, but I remember when I was in school, if all of the kids got together and wanted to have a lock-in in the gymnasium and just read all night, my teachers would have just been ecstatic, right? Well, well, Harry Potter books came out, and that's exactly what kids wanted to do. Now, there were some people that were concerned about the message with Harry Potter, especially with, a cult and those types of things. Pushing that aside, wasn't it cool to find a way to get kids to all want to do something, right? When I was a kid, we had an encyclopedia set in our house. And if I ever went over to the encyclopedia and wanted to look something up, my parents would have been ecstatic. Well, now with your devices, right? I can look something up and AI will talk to me about it. So we now have that and kids now do it. The problem is it kind of swings to the other direction. So how do we make that good? Well, the first thing, we want to make kids want to do it and to be happy with it. And kids are naturally wired to want to make connections with people. Okay. So we need to make sure that we really look at some of what we have in technology and research. For those of you who are religious folks, certainly grounded in the Bible, certainly grounded in the Torah. So we want to look at some of those things and say, how do we make them work today? And that's why I say, if it's 2,000 years ago, if it's 2,000 years from now, I think what works, works. And that's kind of what I'm bringing the message to you all on my television show. And one of the reasons I'm doing this, because I think it's that important to have a body of work that's available to people now and, 10 years from now or whatever. So we're going to take a break and we're going to go right back to some fun things we can do with our families now that we know all this. We'll talk to you soon.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of The Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on The Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
Master of words, powerful player. What life-changing words can Dr. Janet Smith Warfield pull out of her magical toolbox that just might mysteriously open a door you never knew was there? A door to free yourself from fear forever. Transform your rage into right action. Release your guilt. Position you into a life of freedom, purpose, passion, power, and peace. All quite suddenly, unexpectedly, and almost miraculously, with no effort on your part. Join Dr. Janet on Dancing with Words, Dancing with Wisdom, as she and her guests show you how words map our experiences, immersing you in a sound bath that relaxes your muscles, opens your mind, and supports you in co-creating your extraordinary life.
All right, we're back. Okay, fourth segment. This is something fun we're going to do this week. And, one of the things you notice is I definitely looked at the problem, but we also looked at, hey, nothing new under the sun. This has been going on for a long time. It might be a different issue, but we have the power as a community to take back our families, our children, and our relationships if they have drifted. So that's what we're doing. And the last thing to do is to carry this on till next week. So the fun assignment we're going to have to do this week is get people together. All right. Now you may want to start with the grown-ups, but if you want to make it with the kids and everybody's cool with it, that's fine. But you want to set the intention, and first off, you want to do is all get together and have fun talking, collect the devices. Don't be having the devices there. But set the intention, a calm, free phone time to talk. Then what you want to do is go around the room and just tell everybody in the room one or two things that you really like and appreciate about them, what you admire about them, why you think they're neat. Set the tone with positivity, 5-to-1 positivity. Okay. Now, the next thing, and make this fun, don't make this drudgery, share honestly. This is your question to the group. Okay, share honestly how technology affects us, affects you. What do you notice about technology? Okay. So, one of the things I say is, what what would happen if you didn't have media? And just think about it. Just imagine you couldn't get it. Let's say the internet went off, the power went off, the phones won't work. What would you notice about yourself? What would you be afraid of losing if you didn't have those devices? Just hypothetical. All right. Just kind of everybody go around the room and talk about that. Maybe actually ask people to give each other feedback on how they see you with the devices, but again, in a fun way, right? Remember safety first, right? So one thing about that is you can begin to look at rituals of connection. Now, I just mentioned behind me, I've got some Halloween stuff up, but that's one of the things that's a ritual of connection that families do together as a group. And it's really a wonderful thing. And I'll bet you, parents, when you get all that candy home or whatever it is you get, I bet you go through it and you make sure that there's nothing bad in it. Well, that's kind of a metaphor for media as well, isn't it? So, but talk about what you notice when you disconnect from them. Are you more irritable? Are you more preoccupied with getting back to using it? How do you relate to other people when you don't have it? When you don't have it, do you kind of jones out? Do you get crabby? Do you constantly kind of look around? Do you kind of hear phantom rings or texts? I don't know. But have fun with the discussion, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to right size this, and people might complain about it because they're out of shape. But the reality of it is people really, really are hardwired for that human connection and love. And the disconnect from that can cause something we call negative sentiment override, or assuming the negative, and it can affect trust. It can affect the bids. We stop knowing what's important to our people. So the love maps erode. And then if we're that distance and we're into the phone, fondness and admiration goes to the phone. It doesn't go to our people. And then people really start to feel disconnected and lonely. So we have to be careful with that, right? I remember as a tradition, I always called my mom and dad on Tuesday night. I was coming back. I was working at a hospital called Harding Hospital, and I would drive home. It was my late night, but I always called them on Tuesday, and we always had the nicest conversation every week. Now, my parents are gone, but I really still remember back to that tradition. And I don't remember what we talked about necessarily, but I do remember that we did, and I remember their voices, and I remember just chit chatting about what was important that week. And I really miss it, and I wish I had it now. For those of you who still have your people, take advantage of it now. Word to the wise. So very, very important. So I want you to do that. I want you to get together and have a family meeting. Remember, friendship, small daily rituals, trust, transparency about the screen, and I can talk to you about it and not feel threatened. And then shared meaning. The family story gets stronger than any device that you can have. So that's what I want you to do this week. We're going to do that. I want to let you know, back by popular demand, actually, but I had a couple weeks ago a gentleman by the name of Dr. Bill Bunbury, and he just wrote a really interesting book on infidelity and how to overcome it. Excuse me. So I'm going to have him back because there was a lot of questions that people had, but there was also some of the things that he wanted to help us know more. So I was so happy when I asked him, can you come back? And he said, yeah, I'd love to. So next week, 1:00 Eastern time, our regular time, we're going to have him come back and talk about infidelity and a way back into a relationship, even when something like that can affect us. So anyway, I'm Dr. Don Allen. This is all about relationships, moving towards ideal marriages and loving, lasting relationships. Thank you for joining me. I hope you do the exercise. Feel free to contact me, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
While All About Relationships is educational and entertaining, it is not a substitute for therapy, counseling or professional advice, but an informative space for learning and growth. So tune in each week for an engaging and reliable approach to your relationships, ensuring viewers with practical tools to create deeper connections in their daily lives. Whether tackling conflict resolution, emotional intimacy, or family dynamics, this show is your go-to resource for anyone looking to foster healthier, happier relationships in a supportive and lighthearted environment. Every Wednesday, 1 p.m. Eastern.